Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our second read in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is entitled Academic Facts and Fallacies, and the section we're going to be reading is called The Students. As I've mentioned throughout this series, we're doing this series as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Basic Economics, so I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. Also, as I mentioned throughout the course of the series, we'll be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about things. So we've got kind of a short read today, so let's just dive right on in to today's read with Chapter 4. Let's start this over with to today's read, which is in Chapter 4, and Chapter 4 is entitled Academic Facts and Fallacies. And we'll be reading the section, The Students. Students choose colleges and colleges choose students, and there are facts and fallacies involved in both choices. Choices among colleges. Since a college's or university's academic prestige depends primarily on its professors' research and publications, students will not necessarily get a better education at the more prestigious institutions with the higher paid faculty. Various studies have shown students at small liberal arts colleges doing as well as, and sometimes better than, students from prestigious research universities on tests such as those for medical schools, and a higher percentage of the liberal arts college students going on to receive PhDs. This is not very surprising in view of a study indicating that teaching takes up less than half the working time of faculty at research universities and nearly 2/3 of the working time of faculty at liberal arts colleges. The four institutions with the highest percentage of their undergraduates going on to receive PhDs are all small colleges with less than 2,000 undergraduates each: Caltech, Harvey Mudd, Swarthmore, and Reed. Caltech and Harvey Mudd have fewer than 1,000 undergraduates each. Small colleges, in fact, dominate the top 10. Grinnell College has a higher percentage of its graduates go on to receive PhDs than does either Harvard or Yale. Of the chief executive officers of the 50 largest American corporations surveyed in 2006, only 4 had Ivy League degrees, and just over half graduated from state colleges, city colleges, or a community college. Some, including Michael Dell of Dell Computers and Bill Gates of Microsoft, did not graduate at all. One of the biggest fallacies about academic institutions is that attendance at big-name colleges and universities is virtually essential for reaching the top in later life. How much colleges in general add to economic or other success in later life is not easy to determine, and the methods often used can easily overstate the effects of college, and especially the effect of the more prestigious colleges. These methods would be valid if the people attending these institutions were comparable to begin with, so that their differences in incomes and occupations after graduation could be attributed to what happened in college. But if affluent or wealthy people are more likely to send their children to prestigious colleges and universities, then the incomes of those students in later life may reflect their greater career opportunities as a result of their family connections or the greater income from the earnings of inherited assets, rather than what they may have learned at the more prestigious colleges or universities. The students themselves cannot be assumed to be comparable. If students who enter Harvard, for example, have higher qualifications than the students who enter Podunk State, then later differences between the graduates of the two institutions cannot be arbitrarily attributed to differences in the education received in these two places. If Harvard graduates are more likely to go on to medical school, law school, or other postgraduate study, then their later incomes are likely to be raised still further above those of the graduates of Podunk State. Ideally, the comparison should be made between people who went to Harvard and people who were admitted to Harvard but chose instead to go to Podunk State. Unfortunately, this is likely to produce samples too small for statistical analysis, and those who make such choices may not be typical of the students at either institution. Studies have been made of people with comparable test scores who attended prestigious and non-prestigious colleges and universities in order to try to determine the quote-unquote value added by the institutions themselves. Some studies indicate that the more prestigious institutions do add value, and others indicate that they do not. But seldom do they indicate that the value added is as great as the raw statistics might suggest without making allowances for differences among the students themselves. Value added by college. Similar problems arise when trying to determine the value of going to college at all as compared to going to work after finishing high school or not finishing high school. It is common to compare the incomes of college graduates with the incomes of high school graduates, high school dropouts, or others, and then attribute the much higher incomes of the college graduates to the education received in college. But people whose education stops before college cannot be assumed to be the same in orientation, values, priorities, or ability as people who go on to college. Therefore, income differences between them cannot be automatically attributed to what was taught in college. A further complication is that many, if not most, people who drop out of high school later resume some form of education, whether in academic institutions or by studying a trade or acquiring certification from courses given by Microsoft, Oracle, Adobe, or other computer companies. Is the income of dropouts who later resume their education elsewhere to be counted in the statistics on the incomes of dropouts? Are the incomes of dropouts who go on to earn a PhD without ever getting a high school diploma, such as the author of this book, to be included in the statistics on the incomes of dropouts? Or is the term dropout to be reserved solely for those who never resume any further education? As a practical guide to those considering when to discontinue their academic education, at least temporarily, it makes a big difference whether particular statistics make that distinction. Given the greater difficulty and higher costs of following particular individuals over time, it is very doubtful if most statistics, or perhaps any, make that distinction. This means that the incomes of people who dropped out of high school and later received an academic degree without bothering to go back and get a high school diploma are very unlikely to be counted in statistics on the incomes of high school dropouts. The cost of college. Even in an era of high and rising college tuitions, the biggest cost of going to college will in many cases not consist of the tuition being paid, but the cost of foregoing opportunities to earn income from a full-time job. The average tuition at state colleges and universities is often less than the income from an entry-level job, and the tuition at community colleges is almost invariably less. The cost of attending college also includes the growing costs of books, but does not include the full cost of room and board, since students would have to be housed and fed whether they went to college or not. Only to the extent that these costs are higher on campus can they be considered part of the cost of a college education. In short, money outlays do not measure the total cost of going to college, which can be higher or lower depending on the institution and the circumstances. Many lament that the costs of going to college can leave graduates with substantial debts to pay off in later years, and that these debts can be especially burdensome for those who go into occupations with modest pay. Politicians are likely to be responsive to such laments, especially in election years. However, many or most of the discussions of such issues ignore the larger role of costs and prices in general, and proceed as if anyone whose desires are constrained by economics should have those constraints removed by government, which is to say, by shifting those costs to someone else, namely the taxpayers. Among those students who graduate from college owing a debt for their education, the median debt is $19,300, roughly the cost of a modestly priced automobile. And no one thinks that the debt incurred in buying an automobile is so crushing that taxpayers must subsidize the purchase of cars. Moreover, the debt from a college education is paid just once, while most Americans buy more than one automobile in a lifetime. Finally, it is by no means certain that the average taxpayer makes more money than the average college graduate, so the case for forcing taxpayers to subsidize people with better economic prospects than themselves cannot invoke the usual arguments about helping the less fortunate. As for the argument that the burden of debt is heavier for those who enter lower-paying occupations, this ignores the whole role of prices in allocating scarce resources, including expensively educated human beings. It would be an exercise in futility to print money if people's decisions were not to be influenced by it. After all, the money itself is not wealth. Otherwise, the government could make us all rich just by printing more of it. But it's just an artificial device to provide incentives for economic behavior affecting the production of real wealth. If people are automatically to be enabled to make their choices independent of monetary considerations, then there has been an enormous waste of paper and ink in printing money. Seldom is the argument made that nobody should have to take rates of pay into account when choosing among occupations. More usually, there is an assumption that some especially prescient third parties can determine which special occupations really meet society's needs, and therefore should be subsidized through compulsory exactions from others. Such arbitrary choices made by third parties, who pay no price for being wrong, are considered to be either economically or morally superior to choices made by people who pay their own money for what they want and thereby determine which products, industries, and occupations will be remunerated to what extent. All right, that concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So first things first, gotta love these really short reads, right? So it's going to be a really short review because there really isn't much to talk about, because it was a nice, simple, straightforward, straight to the point read here. And basically the entire theme of the read is independent variable control. There are a lot of claims that are made by academics out there who ascribe certain value to certain things, in this case to a college education. And what needs to be done when you make those value judgments is some sort of independent variable control. These are empirical claims. They can be tested and they can be subjected to the scientific method. Further tested via the scientific method to be either proved or disproved, and to what degree. In this case, it would be subject to a multivariate analysis. We'll get into that in a minute. But basically, the crux of the entire read is summed up on page 105 in 2 sentences. The students themselves cannot be assumed to be comparable. If students who enter Harvard, for example, have higher qualifications than the students who enter Podunk State, so that would be an independent variable to control for, then later differences between the graduates of two institutions cannot be arbitrarily attributed differences in the education received in these two places. So what does that mean? That means that if you look at things like, if we look at the people going to college in the first place, and look at them before they've even gone to college, these are probably people who are destined to go on to quote-unquote bigger and better things, regardless of whether or not they went to college. So if you could wave a magic wand and somehow vaporize post-secondary education, so post-12th grade education, here in the United States, you'd find that those people who would otherwise have gotten into these colleges are almost surely going to be doing better off than those people who wouldn't. And college is it is kind of self-evident by the fact that colleges provide exactly this sort of self-selection, and that should obviously predict these outcomes. So when they say things like people who go to college earn 50% more than those who don't, well, how much of that 50% is what they actually got out of the degree, and how much of that is something like that's as predictable as IQ and as predictable as how work ethic, pre-existing work ethic. So if you have a pre-existing work ethic that's really high, and you have we won't use IQ. Let's say you're intelligent. IQ is a measure of intelligence, but as accurate as it may or may not be, it is a measure of intelligence. So if you are super hyper intelligent and you are also hyper conscientious, then that predicts quote unquote success, high income levels, extremely well. And it may even be to a certain degree that the self-selection process that is going on at colleges and universities accounts for all of that. Now, Sowell seems to indicate that that's not the case, that it's all of it, but it's an independent variable that needs to be controlled for. And I think we would all agree probably has a meaningful impact on that 50% number that gets tossed around. So this is what Thomas Sowell means when he talks about value added. He has an entire subsection that I've time-stamped in this video's description called value added. He puts it in scare quotes. And again, what he means is the value that the education itself actually adds. So if you were to project somebody's income level if college never existed versus if it suddenly did exist and they went to college, what is the difference between those two numbers? And he says, of course, that can be kind of difficult to perform, because in this case, it's probably going to require a longitudinal study to perform. A longitudinal study is where you take a look at one person over the course of a very long time, and let's say it's like 30 years. It's basically supposed to be like a lifespan study. So you look at somebody starting in middle school, and you follow where they've gone from middle school age, 10, 11, 12 to their, early 40s. And that would give you what's called a longitudinal study. And you probably have to be doing this a vast multitude of times in order to get a sample size, which could be considered representative of the population. And then you're still going to have to do a ton of independent variable control and subject the test to a multivariate analysis, not a univariate analysis. So when I say an independent variable, you can't just control for one. You have to control for a multitude of them. So a univariate analysis is where you're controlling for one independent variable. A multivariate analysis is where you're controlling for a number of independent variables. So that basically harkens back to what we know about K through 12 education as well. And I'll put a link in this video's description to a video I did on my other channel. It's called The Truth About Public Spending, What Works and What Doesn't. And basically what the research seems to indicate is that what's going on inside the classroom seems to matter a whole lot less than what's going on outside of the classroom, as self-evidently evidenced by the fact that the students who come in, the predicted difference between students from year to year is almost identical to the difference going into the school system. So when students first enroll in public schooling, there's a difference in performance and aptitude, if you will, going in that largely doesn't change for some time while they're in the system. So it seems so. In relative terms, if you control for all other things, if you do your independent variable controls. So that's something that I found interesting, and it's something that's kind of an addendum to the read, so I'll link to that in this video's description. And then I guess there's not much else to say in terms of the analysis. So if we're going to give like a review of the read, this is one of my favorite reads, not only because it's short and it's sweet and there's some empiricism going on here, but because on page 108, it's just nonstop shots fired. And I just love the way he so brilliantly and so succinctly provides these, shots fired, arguments, if you will, to counter those from the left. So one of the big principles one of the things that he points out that actually starts on page 107 and continues on to page 108. However, many or most of the discussions of such issues, which is the cost of college, ignore the larger role of costs and prices in general and proceed as if anyone whose desires are constrained by economics should have these constraints removed, and then here's the big point, by government, here's the big point, which is to say by shifting those costs to someone else, namely the taxpayers. So what you've effectively done by having the taxpayers fund somebody's college tuition, if that's how you're going to do it, if you're making it tuition free, if you're making colleges free, you're not actually making it free. You're just shifting the burden of risk onto the consumer at the very best by printing out money. And if you don't print the money, then you have to levy taxes, which means that you're just shifting the name of the person who's paying the bill. And I love that he points out this is an example of empiricism. So he gives an example of the principle by way of analogy. Among those students who graduate from college owing a debt, this is page 108, among those students who graduate from college owing a debt for their education, the median debt is $19,300, roughly the cost of a modestly priced automobile. And then he basically goes on to say, well, why don't we make automobiles free? Why don't we make everything that costs that much money and requires people to incur that amount of debt free? Homes. Don't you think a home is important to somebody's livelihood? Don't you think being able to move around in a place that isn't Manhattan, which requires a car at this point, don't you think that's important to somebody's livelihood? Just as important as the college degree, at least. Hey, I got to be able to get to my job. Otherwise, I can't get the job. Hey, I got to be able to have a roof over my head and survive the night. Otherwise, there's no point in even having the job, let alone getting it. So I love that he points that out. That's a fair analogy to be made. Remember, he's presented the principle, and then he's giving an example by way of analogy. And it is a perfectly analogous association to be made, because the expenditure is an apt analog of the thing in question. And remember that analogs don't have to be the exact thing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be analogs of the thing. They would be the thing. And finally, as a brief aside, another one of the shots fired on page 108, he goes on to explain, and I'll put a link to this video's description to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations when we did that read, because Smith does a much more thorough investigation into this claim. It would be an exercise in futility to print money if people's decisions were not to be influenced by it. After all, the money itself is not wealth. So what a lot of people who would be making these claims and who suffered this fallacy don't understand is that money itself is not wealth. The money isn't the thing. It is a medium of exchange. The clothes on my back are what are the wealth itself. They are the thing that makes my life more comfortable. I can exchange currency for it, but the currency itself isn't going to keep me warm at night unless I literally duct tape it to my chest. These are the exchange I make, the exchange decision I make is based on the price of the clothing, and this is through a trade-off, an unavoidable trade-off. When I say unavoidable, it's because there is no way to avoid the existence of trade-offs. I can go outside and be cold, or I can go outside and be nice and warm. And that decision is something that I make based on the price of the thing. What will it cost me in terms of my productivity in order to have the shirt? Even if I'm on an island by myself with no currency, if there's a deer roaming the woods, I could kill the deer, I could skin the deer, I could go through all that rigmarole, or I could just say, forget it, I'm not killing a deer, I'm not going through all that, and I'll just continue hunting rabbits, because it's just easier to catch rabbits than it is to go catch a deer. So that price allows me to make that decision myself. And we can go into further detail as to the role of that. And again, that's further extrapolated in pedantic detail in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So that was today's read. I got a little bit long in the tooth in terms of the analysis and review, and that's mostly because I loved this read. This is part of one of my favorite reads in the entire book, and this is one of my favorite books from Thomas Sowell. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. We will see you in the next video, which will on Thomas Sowell. Will be the section in Chapter 4 entitled Academic Finances, where he spends a little bit more time going into the finances of post-secondary education. So until then, this is Men Mike signing off.